So I'm just going to bid a good afternoon to all our virtual attendees here. Thank you. And welcome to St. George Society New York's first virtual webinar. Apparently, this is a webinar, I've been told. People younger than me knew what that was. It's really lovely to have been asked to host this. And I'm joined by Adrian Tinniswood, OBE. And thank you very much, Adrian, first of all, for giving us your time. And
Delighted.
secondly, crucially, thank you for everyone that's helped make this work and bring it together. There's a lot of effort in the background and dealing with the technology, and here we are. So that is excellent. So for those of you who might not know much about the society, we are a 255-year-old organization, and we were founded to help those in need in this city. We've got three major programs. We have a beneficiary program, which looks after elderly residents in New York, many of whom have a Commonwealth connection. We have a scholarship fund, which looks after final year students as part of the CUNY network here in New York, that being the City University of New York. And then we have a family support fund, which is very dear to my heart. And we're actively involved in looking after the families of children who have pediatric cancer. And I'm personally involved as a chauffeur, meeting those children at JFK and bringing them into the city. And Adrian and I can chat about chauffeurs later because they figure in the country house world greatly as the ages went on. We run plenty of events, physical, actual events in the city, pub quizzes, pancake day, bonfire night, that sort of stuff. But here we have a new mode of sharing our society with everybody, which is interesting. A little bit about me. My name is Mark Aston. I'm the second vice president of the St. George's Society, which, yes, that does mean we have two vice presidents. And I found out about the society 25 years ago or so. I got involved more and more. Now I'm very involved. I do enjoy it. I get more out of it than I put in, that's for certain. And I'd like to think that some of you people that are joining us virtually, we might see you at an event in the not too distant future. So, quick overview of what we're going to try and do. Adrian and I are going to chat about his book, and then we're going to follow this with a Q&A about the book, which is called The Power and the Glory. And then we'll leave 20 minutes or so at the end for questions from any of you. I think you'll figure out there's a little chat box there. And if you pop in a question, Katie here and Alex will spot that and we'll see if we can answer it for you. Adrian. Adrian is an English writer and historian. He's currently based in Ireland, and he is sitting in Ireland right now, which just blows my mind, but there you go. Professor of history at the University of Buckingham in England, and he's also an adjunct professor at Maynooth University in Ireland. So from all of us, Adrian, welcome. And like I said, thank you for sharing part of your day with us. It's a pleasure to be able to speak to you. And I'm excited to hear about the background of how you set about getting into this book and how you created it. And I'm excited about sharing what's inside the book, which I did enjoy. So here we go. Kick off. Adrian, can you take us back a little bit to how your passion for British history began? Was there a particular moment when that started?
There, there was, and first of all, thank you for having me. It's really good to be joining you, even if it is joining you from County Mayo in Ireland. And isn't it marvellous that we can talk like this? You're
Yeah,
right, Mark. Fantastic. But yeah, I studied English and philosophy at university. It's an awfully long time ago now. Gosh, nearly half a century. Can't be. But I wasn't particularly interested in the stately homes of England. I wasn't even that interested in history. And then when I left university, I got a temporary job at a place called Sudbury Hall in Derbyshire in the English Midlands, which was a mid late 17th century country house that was being run by the National Trust. And I took that job because I wasn't sure what else to do. I was just researching the house and taking visitors around, that kind of thing. And something just clicked. It was really strange. Something just clicked. The minute I walked in the door, I thought, this is all I want. This is all I want to do. And for the last 50 years, it is basically all I've been doing is talking about country houses. If I hadn't taken that job, I don't know where I'd be. It's one of those sort of wonderfully odd moments, connections.
Yeah, yeah. It's
And Sudbury is
interesting.
still, all these years later, Sudbury is still, you never forget your first.
Yeah,
And Sudbury is still a very, very special house to me. It's a
that's
wonderful
fascinating.
place.
Yeah, that random opportunity in many ways of
Yeah,
you happen to pick up that position that's taken you down a path that is very much
exactly.
yours. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. So as to the actual book, now I'm going to confess I'm not the greatest reader in the world. Um, I, and but I really enjoyed this a lot. It is full of facts. And I found myself reading it with my iPhone in my hand, so I could quickly look up where the houses were that you mentioned. Were they still around? What did they look like? So I found that each page took a while to get through because there was just so much stuff to look into, which that really captured my attention. I thought that was great.
I love it.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
It's
Uh,
actually, Mark, it's the circumstances of the writing it were quite odd in that a few years ago, I wrote a book called The Long Weekend, which was about the country house between the wars.
uh-huh,
And I've been wanting to write about the 20th century country house for ages, but my American publisher, who have been wonderful to me, Basic, they weren't that sure that a book about the country house would sell. And then Downton Abbey happened. I've got cause to be grateful to
good.
Downton Abbey
Yeah.
because that enabled me to write The Long Weekend, this book about the house between the wars. I
Mhm.
followed it up a couple of years later with another book called Noble Ambitions, which is about the country house after the Second World War.
Mm.
And in fact, although I've done it the wrong way around, The Power and the Glory is the first part of a trilogy, if you like, looking at 100 years of country house life.
Yeah.
So I did the first bit. I saved the best till last, the first till last.
Right, right, right. Well, as you're touching on the book itself, I mean, what's the sort of general synopsis of it? What's how does it go through the
So,
history of the
I mean, starting the story in the 1870s and finishing it, with 1914, with the start of the Great War, the First World War. My idea was to look at life in the English country house, the British country house, how the house was used by its owners, by their guests, by their servants. But one of the things, as I was working on it, one of the things that emerged was the importance of incomers, of new blood, of nouveau riche. You have the traditional landed elite, if you like, the country, the dukes and the earls and the dukes of Devonshire at Chatsworth, the dukes of Marlborough at Blenheim. You've got them, but you've also got new blood coming in all kinds of different ways in the later 19th century. Um, for example, you've got Americans. You've got Americans coming in. I mean, we know the story about the kind of bartered brides, if you like. The Consuelo Vanderbilts,
Yeah,
the heiresses whose mothers sold them for a title kind of
yeah,
thing, and some of them very happy as well. I mean,
mm,
Consuelo was miserable, but some of them made very successful, happy marriages.
right,
And if their marriages weren't happy and successful, then they divorced and moved on to another duke
right,
or lord.
right, right. Well, now this brings up an interesting thing that in the early part of your book, talking
Mm,
about early to mid 1800s, the houses were owned by people who were not necessarily cash rich.
yeah,
They had their titles and they were the house had been handed down to them. And I doubt that they were keeping up the houses physically, in the way that they should have. So then you have this injection of new owners, the
yeah,
nouveau riche, as you're mentioning, who were interested in maintaining and preserving the actual building and not just
absolutely right.
the society that revolved around the
Yeah,
house. So it
yeah.
was it wasn't a bad thing.
And I mean, in a way, that's, you've got an influx of American blood coming in, but you've also got, along with it, an influx of American corn and wheat and meat imports, and this leads to what's still called the agricultural depression of the 1870s and 80s. Now, what that meant was that a lot of these big landowners who had, tenant farmers, the tenants couldn't pay the rent, corn prices started to fall, and you start to see country houses being sold off. You start to see some of those, as you say, the traditional landowners, country house owners, some of them couldn't keep up. And changes in the law, I mean, some of them quite boring, the changes in the law. One of the big ones was that whereas everyone will, if you know your Jane Austen, you'll know about how estates tended to be entailed for a couple of generations, which means that the owner of a country house wasn't actually the owner. They were the kind of custodian, and they had to hand it on along with all the heirloom furniture and art objects to the next generation. They couldn't sell it. Well, relaxations in the law meant that they could. And you start to see a lot more in the 1890s, early 1900s. You see a lot more country houses coming on the market.
Right.
And they're bought. Yes, they're sold, but they're bought.
Yeah. And the Settled Land Acts, which you went in.
They're the ones. Yeah.
That's all about that. But then, much to their disdain, the Chancellor of the Exchequer realized that there was some money to be had here, and started taxing those sales, didn't he? There's
no doubt. I mean, to start with, it's really not a big deal. Death duties come in 1894, and they're a couple of percent of the value of an estate. It's nothing. People complained, of course, because people always complain about taxes, but it wasn't that big a deal. By the 1930s, if you had an estate that was worth £2 million, say, so what's that? $3 million, say. And that's a big estate in the 1930s. When you died, your heirs had to find 40% of the value of that estate to pay in taxes. By 1950, they had to find 80% of the value. And of course, you couldn't. You couldn't hang on to the house and the contents and the land and find 80% of the value. It just couldn't be done. And so there's no doubt that rising death duties and estate taxes were a major contributing factor to the crisis of the country house that was occurring right through the 20th century in lots of ways.
Yeah. Now, the style of how you wrote the book, did you sort of consciously try and make this a bit more accessible to people who aren't necessarily, historians? Because I did find it very,
I love gossip. I love gossip. I start off always from one basic premise. That is, architecture is not about buildings, it's about people. It's about patterns of behavior and their expression in stone and wood and glass and whatever. And also, I'm a sucker for gossip. The scandal, the dodgy stories about. I can't stop. I love them. I absolutely love them.
I did enjoy some of those. Isadora Duncan, believe it or not, enters into your book, which I
didn't realise that there is a wonderful house. And if any of our audience, our viewers, are ever in Devon, in the southwest of England, go to Paignton, the seaside town, where there's this fabulous house called Oldway Mansion. And Oldway was actually built by a New Yorker. Oldway was built by Isaac Singer, who was patented the automatic sewing machine. And made a fortune. He amassed a huge amount of money. He also, in New York, amassed a huge quantity of illegitimate children. I mean, the last count, it was about 24. Some of them were legitimate. He wasn't altogether clear as to whether his women folk were mistresses or wives. And there's a dangerous overlap, unfortunately. But that his behaviour forced him out of New York. He went to Paris first, and then to England. And he built this wonderful, wonderful house. It was partly finished when he died in 1874, but his son Paris, and we're in kind of Brooklyn Beckham territory here, in that Paris was so called because that's where he was conceived. His son Paris Singer turned Oldway into a miniature Versailles and installed his mistress, who, to come back to your original point, was Isadora Duncan.
Yeah.
and installed her in the house. She
Yeah.
hated it.
Yeah.
She said all English people did was kind of slop around in muddy lanes
Yeah.
and eat too much food.
I
And
love that
she,
you brought that book up because, sorry, that book, that house up, because that was literally one of the houses that I read about. I thought, oh, I really have to go and see that place. So
it's
many of them
fantastic.
I want to
It's
heard of.
fallen on sad times now. There's a
Yeah,
group of
yeah,
volunteers are striving
yeah,
to save it, to keep it.
yeah.
The gardens are being restored. The house has been was turned into offices,
Right,
civic offices at one time. But
right,
it's a fabulous building. And Paris Singer, Paris Singer, when he got bored with, he's one of the first sort of jet setters, in that he had homes in Paris, in
mhm,
London, in
mhm,
Devon, and in New York. And in fact, um, he invented Palm Beach. Paris Singer. He in the about 1914, 1915, he left England
right,
and he'd left Isadora, and he went off to America
right,
and started to build a resort.
right.
So we owe quite a lot to Paris
Yeah.
Singer.
And
He's
who
an
was that? The
interesting
other
chap.
name in Flagler? I think he was
Yeah,
a
yeah. Flagler was involved as well,
yeah,
but
yeah.
Paris Singer was apparently one of the very first to see the possibilities.
Now that's interesting. So I'm a bit off track here, but let's keep this. We'll keep this thread going.
Hmm.
The singer who came to Britain and sort of really bought into the whole
Yeah.
country house thing. He and I think many others weren't just buying into the physical, I want a big house. They were using that as an entree
Oh, very
into
much, very
society
much. Yeah.
and trying to almost validate themselves in a new social position.
I mean, there are two good examples of that in the book. I mean, the famous one, I think, is William Waldorf Astor,
Mhm.
who came over in the 1880s, early 1890s, bought Cliveden, a massive house outside London on the Thames, got a little bit bored with that, and then bought Hever Castle in the southeast of England in Kent, which is the Boleyn family home.
Mhm.
It's where Anne Boleyn's ghost is still said to walk, and he became more English than the English.
Yeah,
He wrote a series of appalling mock archaic stories about historic figures. I mean, he owned a string of newspapers, so he could get these things published. If he hadn't owned the newspapers, he would never have got this stuff. It was
no,
awful.
no,
But he just wallowed in that idea of the past and of an English past, a
yeah,
distant past. He loved the Middle Ages. He loved the kind of the English Civil War period.
yeah,
Um, and he just kind of fantasized. I mean, he saved Hever Castle. When he really restored it, he did a brilliant job.
right, right.
But he is again one of those Americans who came over and became a pillar of English society.
Yeah, yeah. I've got the book open here actually. I've got a little penciled asterisk on a couple of lines, which hopefully I can read these without stumbling. But which refer to the country homes articles in those magazines, which I'm sure really sort of
In country life.
yeah
Yeah,
in country life. So they really sold the idea of the country house and everything that went with it. And these articles it mentions here that there were the writers they were underpinned by the conviction that the country house was not only woven into the fabric of English society, but represented all that was best about the society: good taste in leadership, hierarchy, and community, and above all, country life. So,
yeah,
suggesting that if you owned one of these houses,
yeah.
you had an entree into this world that you know ordinary folk were not going to get into.
Absolutely right. Absolutely right. And I mean, so many nouveau riche industrialists who bought country houses or built country houses, got a lot of new houses being built. This was the pot of gold at the end of their rainbow.
Mhm.
They'd slogged their guts out. They'd made themselves rich. They'd worked 12-hour days for decades.
Mm.
Now they've made their pile. They've made their
Yeah,
money.
yeah,
The thing to do was to find their way into county society,
right.
to make sure that their daughters taught at the Sunday school and their wife
Yeah.
brought soup round to the poor and the sick in the village, and they entertained their neighbours, their high class neighbours.
Yeah.
It was part of it was part of what everybody was working towards. And you're right, it's what underpins it is that notion that country life and country house life is the best life of all. And
Right.
of course, it was if you were at the top of the tree. It wasn't as much fun if you were a scullery maid, but
No.
if you were at the top.
Yeah. And whereas in the early 1800s, the residents of those houses, you could barely call them houses, they hadn't acquired those positions. It was more hereditary.
Yeah, yeah,
And okay, they probably had a line towards royalty, which kept them in a wonderful part of society. But the house just came along with them, as it were. It
yeah,
it, it
yeah.
wasn't what had created them.
And I mean, some of the I know you know Cragside in the north of England, in the
Yeah.
northeast of England, and it's one of my favourite houses. If your audience don't know it, it's worth a look next time you're in England.
Mm.
And it was built not by a duke or an earl. It was built by a lawyer, an engineer, an inventor, an armaments manufacturer
Yeah.
called William
Yeah.
Armstrong.
Yes.
Who made a colossal amount of money out of guns,
Yes.
and then built what started off as a little lodge, a little fishing lodge, way out in the country, and was gradually extended. I mean, his architect, Richard Norman Shaw, was a genius of a country house. It was said that Richard Norman Shaw, when he went out to dinner, he would his dress suit, his tuxedo underneath. He'd make sure he got extra long cuffs on his shirt, because if he found himself at dinner sitting next to a potential client, he'd sketch out their country house on his cuff. And by the time they got to dessert, he got a new job.
Yeah. Yeah.
He
Fabulous.
was brilliant with Cragside. And
Yeah.
Cragside is interesting. I mean, it's interesting in that it's filled with new technology, the kind of technology which had made William Armstrong rich.
Mhm.
But also it harks back to a kind of mythical golden age. It's not of any one period, but it looks back to it's got Tudor chimney stacks, it's got battlements, it's got Georgian bay windows, it's got half timbered gables,
Mm.
and takes a bit of everything, not to be false or authentic, but just to remind us, to evoke a romantic past age. And of course, that's what a lot of those country life articles were doing, we were talking about.
Right.
They were evoking the romance of the
Yeah.
past. And that's such a big driver in country house thinking. I mean, I if I may, there's a tiny quote here from the very first Country Life article, the very first issue of Country Life in 1897 was about a house called Baddesley Clinton in Warwickshire, in the English Midlands. It's a great house, moated manor house. I mean, it is as quaint as you can get. And that very first article doesn't say much about the history of the place, but it says, let me just give you a couple of lines. It says, in the mind's eye, dead men loom out of the shadows when the moonlight falls through the tinted glass. And in imagination's ear, the rustle of brocaded silks and satins is heard anon as the wind whispers through the galleries and the rain patters down on the storied panes. I mean, anon. Nobody used the word anon in 1897, but there's this kind of very conscious and
Yeah.
self-conscious
So
wallowing.
coming back to Armstrong, that puts me nicely in what I wanted to chat about. So first of all, we'll continue about Armstrong. So I'm a Geordie from Northumberland. I was aware of Cragside, and there always was the rumor that it was one of the first houses lit by electricity. I don't think it was the first, but it was certainly one of the first.
They
But
say hydroelectricity now. They say
right,
hydro, powered by water. That's
yeah.
what they
So
say.
we had Cragside, which is this most just outrageous shooting lodge, as it were. And then he had Jesmond Dean,
Yes.
which is Gosforth, the nice suburb of Newcastle. That there's a restaurant there now, so you can visit that and see the building. It's there, and that is the most beautiful spot. But then he also bought Bamburgh Castle, didn't he?
That's the end of his life. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah, and that was supposed to be, I think, like a convalescence.
Yeah. It was in memory of his wife who died. That was the idea, but then he died before it could really
Right.
happen.
Right. And I was lucky to visit Bamborough Castle last year, and you can tour the private apartments, and it is quite interesting. And to think that this fellow who was an industrialist, an engineer and an inventor, but he amassed some serious wealth, certainly in real estate, as we call it in America, just huge properties. And then
Yeah.
he set about modernizing them without ruining them. So I thought he was very interesting. Also, now Katie has asked me to talk about Edward Guinness because she knows I
Wow.
like Guinness. But he was, I suppose, nouveau riche. We wouldn't think
Very
of
much. Yeah.
nouveau riche now. Um, and would you class him as also one of those wealthy new money
Now,
people as it back then that came in and did the same with houses, a house?
well done, Katie, because as it happens, my next book is about the country houses of the Guinness family.
That must be a big book.
It is. I mean, my gosh, they got about that much.
Yeah.
And you're right. I mean, Edward Guinness, Lord Ivy, as he became,
Hmm.
isn't one of the richest men in Europe, one of the richest men in the world at one point, all from brewing. But he and his family have a string of massive country houses. They have Farmley Park in Phoenix Park in Dublin, which is still there. It's now a guest house for foreign dignitaries, but it's a huge place. They had Ashford Castle, which is a beautiful, very high-end hotel in the west of Ireland.
Hmm.
Um, the daughters, his granddaughters, had country houses. They had Luttrellstown, they had Clandeboy, they had Lugalore, which was a fabulous house in the Wicklow Mountains. Then Edward had Ivy House in Stephen's Green in Dublin. He also had he had a townhouse in Grosvenor Square, I think it was, in London, and he had Elvedon in Suffolk, which is a tremendous country house. Elvedon, we were talking about incomers, about new blood coming into the country house world. Well, Elvedon was originally bought or at least remodeled for Duleep Singh, who was the last emperor of the last Maharaj of the Sikh Empire, and
Hmm.
whose realm was taken by the East India Company, and he was brought over to England as a child. He was given a pension,
Hmm.
and he bought this shooting estate in Suffolk and built. And if you look at Elvedon, it's okay. It's a bit dull. It's kind of like an Italianate block of a house, big but not exciting. When you step inside, it drips with Rajput decoration, with carvings, and the ceilings kind of writhe. And that's the house when Duleep Singh went bust, as he did, because although he had a big pension, he spent a great deal more than his pension brought in.
Hmm.
The house was bought in 1894 by Edward Guinness, by Lord Ivy.
Hmm. Hmm.
He also bought Kenwood on the edge of Hampstead Heath.
Hmm.
Bought that not because
Yeah.
he wanted to live there, but because it was threatened, and he bought it for the nation. He bought it
Yeah.
and just gave it away.
Yeah. Yeah. Now you spent a lot of time in the book describing him. He was absolutely bonkers, wasn't he?
No, who's bonkers?
The Sing. Yeah.
Duleep Singh. Yeah, he was crazy,
Yeah.
completely
Mad as
crazy.
a box of frogs.
Yeah, completely.
Yeah. Very entertaining.
And he had, I mean, he had an amazing group of kids. One of his sons, Victor, Prince Victor Duleep Singh, was the first Indian to marry into the white British aristocracy. He married Lady Anne Coventry, the Earl of Coventry's daughter.
Mhm.
Uh, there was another son, Frederick, who became an antiquary, who specialised in Stuart relics, the
Yeah.
relics of the mid 17th century,
Yeah.
and who, when he died, was described by somebody as the very archetype of the English gentleman, which is
Right.
great.
Right. Right. Just looking back at the Guinness family, I work in the art world here in New York, and I actually did a lot of work for Murto Guinness, who's on the banking side of the Guinness
Yeah.
people, and he had a townhouse on East 81st Street, but he had a magnificent house in Barbados,
Wow.
which
Yeah.
I worked at for a week, and you would enter
Wow.
it was all overgrown and really spooky. You'd enter through these huge stone columns with carved monkeys on the top, and all the grounds were full of monkeys. But the wonderful story I heard from one of the few staff that was still there was that he died there, and the rumor was that the maids kept his body in the freezer because they knew that when it got out that he died, they wouldn't get paid anymore. Which I absolutely loved. But but anyway, I'm digressing. But anyway, so that was his place in
I love it. I love it.
yeah, it's a good one, isn't it? Now here's another guy that I really enjoyed you talking about was Andrew Carnegie,
I
who
know.
he bought the whole concept, didn't he? Hook,
Yeah,
line, and
but,
sinker.
I mean, he became the kind of professional Scot.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
There's a line in his autobiography. One chapter opens, "When we went back to New York from Scotland, we took our piper with us,"
yeah, yeah.
which he
Yeah,
did.
like you do.
Yeah, of course. I mean, what else do you do with a piper?
Yeah,
And
yeah.
this, the
Tell us a
guests at
bit about him and how he because he had that fabulous castle, didn't he?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, he's born. I mean, he's born a Scot. You know, he's born in Dunfermline,
Right.
and he goes over and makes his money in steel and whatever it was in Pittsburgh. You know, makes himself a fortune.
Mm.
He spends in the 1890s. He and his wife Louise. He marries quite late. They spend their summers in Scotland. He's trying to get back to his roots, and they rent various houses until eventually they come across Skibbo Castle in the Highlands, which is a bit run down. It's not been looked after. The owner was embroiled in all kinds of legal disputes. And Andrew Carnegie comes in, he buys it, and he basically rebuilds it. Well, he and Louise, I mean, his wife, plays quite an important part. And they create this colossal castle. You can still see it today. It's a hotel now, I think. It's
Yeah,
a
yeah.
huge place. But one of my favourite Carnegie stories is in 1902, they'd settled in and things were just about finished. And they heard that Edward VII was going to come and visit. That morning, he was staying about 20 miles away, and he'd heard about Skibbo, and just said, like you can do when you're a king. Oh, let's go and take a look.
Yeah.
And complete panic. You imagine being told, the king's going to pop in
Yeah.
in half an hour or so.
Yeah.
And they
had to quickly wake the piper, didn't they? Yeah, they had to drag their piper out of bed.
They had to get the piper out of bed to play. But then Carnegie received the king in the library at Skibbo, and for reasons I just do not understand, he recited to the king this amazingly anti-English poem by an American patriot, a poem called Usland, US Land, which has this line in it: "Hail to thee, fat Edward." And at that point, Carnegie stops and says to the king, "That's you, sire." It didn't go down very well at all. The king was called Tum Tum behind his back. I mean, he was very fat, but he was very sensitive about it.
Yeah, yeah.
And it was only when the Carnegie's 5-year-old daughter Margaret turned up with a rose in her hand and shoved it in the king's face and said, "This is for you." And the king couldn't do anything but melt. So sweet.
Now, how do you think Carnegie compared with Waldorf Astor as to how William Waldorf Astor, as to how he went about ingratiating himself into
I mean, Carnegie gave a lot of work to local people. I mean, an awful lot of work. And of course, I mean, he's most famous still today. He's most famous as a philanthropist, isn't he? He gave away most of his fortune.
There's still the men.
Yeah, I mean, Carnegie libraries, scattered around Scotland. He was much more I mean, people, if he went out to dinner, people expected him to take his checkbook with him. They were always kind of hustling, for cash.
Right.
But he's much more kind of positive, I suppose, in his role. He contributes a lot to British society. Astor doesn't so much. He saved Hever Castle, but he was known as William Walled Off Astor because he didn't like visitors. He stopped people coming in the park. He built a beautiful a kind of mock medieval village outside the walls of Hever Castle. Yeah. And it was for guests. But the main reason he built it was because he didn't like guests staying in the house with him. He was paranoid. He had to kind of pull up the drawbridge and feel safe at night. He slept with a revolver under his pillow.
Right. So Carnegie, as you said, was born in Scotland. Where was Astor born? I don't know.
They come from a New York family, I think, New York State family.
Yeah, yeah.
Because
There was more of a connection, I think, in Carnegie's heart
very definitely,
that he
very
felt
definitely,
alive,
and
apart from the fact that he was still new to the country and would make those ridiculous gaffes in front of the king that
but
no,
also, I mean, Astor never got over. I think he famously said, or notoriously said, that New York or America was no place for a gentleman. And of course, the American press brought that up at every possible opportunity.
yeah,
So, although he was American, he became a naturalized British citizen. But although he was an American, Astor had a very uneasy relationship with America, I think.
yeah,
And
interesting.
he was powerful. He was a newspaper magnate. He was very rich. He had this string of houses,
Yeah,
but you don't feel he fitted in the way that Carnegie did.
right,
Carnegie's. I'd like to know more about Andrew Carnegie. Actually, I mean,
right.
he's a fascinating character.
Yeah, yeah. And here we are. We're just talking about two or three of these of Americans that had come and sort of en engrossed themselves in the whole country house life, as it were. But
Mm.
but there were many there were many others
Yeah,
who
and
did
they've all got stories
very
to tell. Mark. That's the thing.
yeah.
They're all interesting.
Yeah, yeah, and what I found fascinating was, I saw your book, have it here, and thought, well, that's about country houses. That'll be interesting. But there's only a bit about country houses. It's more about how the country house fitted into society, and it's really 100 years of how society has changed.
One of my favourites, Mark, is one of my favourite characters in this book is a woman called Belle Bilson. Belle was a music hall artiste. She was a burlesque singer and dancer. But she married the Viscount Dunlow, who was the brainless son of the Earl Clancarty. Earl Clancarty was a courtier. He got a huge estate in Ireland and houses in England. And Earl Clancarty was not pleased to find that his 21-year-old son had married a dancer, a chorus girl, older than him, with an illegitimate child, the father of whom was serving 6 months in Pentonville for fraud. He wasn't pleased. And he persuaded his son to try and divorce Belle. And to cut a long story short, the divorce case failed. They accused her of adultery. It wasn't proven. The private detectives that Earl Clancarty hired conveniently lost all their notebooks the day before the trial. They were cooking up evidence. Belle, when she got off, when the trial failed, she was carried on people's shoulders down the Strand with people cheering and yelling. The interesting thing about that, though, Mark, before I leave it, is that she and Dunlow then actually got their marriage together, and she became a very successful Countess Clancarty, as she was. She was, I've seen a wonderful photograph of her in her coronation robes. She fitted in a way that we think she couldn't possibly, could she? She fitted in perfectly.
But I've got a question here that John Windsor Cunningham, who's been very, very patient and popped a few questions our way. But this, it's kind of interesting because it works for what we're talking about right now. This is before we'll get into the Q&A. I thought we'll pop this in now. And he's asked, have your studies, Adrian, help you discover things that have not necessarily been said about country houses before? I mean, have you dug up any secrets or things that were sort of lost in time that weren't that we've now found interesting or that you now
I
found
don't. I don't know. I mean, there are always stories that have been forgotten. That one unearths, and little stories about burglaries and country houses.
yeah,
I became fascinated with true life crime and country houses, of which there were many,
right,
many stories. So I think some of the individuals that I've found out about, they're known. I wouldn't say I wouldn't say that some of them are not well known. One of my favourites is Thomas Thornycroft, who was an inventor and had a crazy house outside Wolverhampton in the English
right.
Midlands, and which he had a thing about sewer gases, and he having tried to
Haven't we
pipe
all?
fresh air from Brighton to London so that people could have fresh air.
Yeah, I love that.
It didn't go well,
No.
that enterprise.
Yeah,
He
I
then,
think wind. I think the wind. I think the weather does that anyway. But
exactly, exactly. But I mean, he created this crazy country house and Tattenhall Towers,
yeah,
which had huge chimneys where he could burn off his sewer gas. There were flames at the top of these.
yeah,
He built a theatre with a 35-foot wide screen for his magic lantern shows, in which he showed people magic lantern presentations about the perils of sewer gas.
yeah, yeah,
But the guy was crazy, completely nuts. He couldn't stop. And you've got heated sock racks. You've
yeah.
got he
I love one
invented
of those.
a neck bath because Victorian medicine
Yeah,
said if you got your head wet in the shower, you would die. Of course you would. Pneumonia, and that was it,
yeah,
rheumatic fever.
yeah, yeah.
So he invented a neck shower, so you can have a shower and keep your head dry. I don't know quite how that worked actually,
No,
but I'm sure it was very successful.
yeah,
He's
no,
crazy, and people like that, they're very minor characters in the history of things.
yeah,
And yet, like Belle Bilson, she's a very, she's a footnote to history, and I
yeah.
love her. I just love her. She's
Right.
great.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, I asked about if you dug anything up. What about ghosts? I think you dug up a couple of ghosts, didn't you?
Ah, there's some great ghosts.
Obviously, you're going to go with this topic.
I got fixated on the idea of the country house ghost because around about the turn of the century, country house ghosts become a really big thing. They're in the stories of M.R. James, famous ghost story writer. Even Oscar Wilde writes Canterville Chase, which is about the Canterville Ghost, which is about an American family, Hiram Otis and his wife and kids, who rent a country house in England, Canterville, and it's got a ghost. And the kids, to start with, Otis advises the ghost to take some of his patent lubricating oil because his chains are squeaking and rattling and he really needs to kind of try and get some sleep. Then the kids plague this ghost. They frighten him so much he goes and hides under the bed for a week and won't come out. So you've also got, apart from literature, you've got like Henry James, Turn of the Screws, another country house ghost story. You've actually got ghost stories in country houses themselves. One of my favourites, one of the weirdest ones, is about Bert and Agnes Hall in north of England. And the story was that there were three sisters living there. And the youngest one said that if she died first, she wanted them to keep her head. They could bury a body in the local churchyard. She wanted them to keep her head on the hall table. And that's kind of an odd request, That's an odd request. She does die. And they ignore a request, of course. They bury her in a coffin in the churchyard. The next night, they come downstairs, and there's her head on the hall table, which must have been quite dramatic. So they go, they have it dug up. They found the head's missing. They pop the head back on. They put it back in the grave. The next night, the head's there again. And they keep. Sorry, there is no climax to this story. I don't know. It doesn't seem to have ended. It seems to have petered out. But there's just this weird notion about this young girl wanting her head to sit on the table. Visitors would have been slightly kind of puzzled, I think, to say the least.
Yeah. And then you had the story of Ham House, I think, or Petersham.
Near Richmond.
That guy said he was going to stay there and just and sort of debunk the ghost story, and he had a fellow with him. The guy who was...
You're thinking of Rainham Hall. Rainham Hall.
Rainham Hall.
See, every country house has got a ghost, but yes, yeah. Rainham Hall, where there was famous brown lady who was supposed to walk.
That's it. The
or white lady or grey lady. Yeah. They did change colour. We was never quite sure, but I think she was a brown lady. This one.
Yeah.
The brown lady. She appeared in a brown gown, and they both laughed at the. They decided to stay at Rainham, and they both laughed at this guy and his friend laughed at the idea. They were both so frightened by about midnight by all these strange noises and creaking around that the ghost of the brown lady. They were convinced she was there, and they just hid in the bedroom until daylight.
Yeah,
amazing.
Yeah. So we talked about the houses physically, and then how the nouveau riche in many ways rescued some of them. Here we are now. We're in the 21st century. What do you see as the future of so many of these houses? I mean, are there enough wealthy people around to deal with the astronomical bills, or do we hope that the likes of National Trusts and those sort of bodies will take them over?
The National Trust has done good work.
Yeah.
and continues to do good work, but has only got maybe 300 houses, and there are thousands. There are several thousand.
Mm.
Do you know, in the 21st century, the country house is better off than it's been for generations, I think.
Mm.
Country house owners have diversified. There was a relaxation in the law in England in the 1990s, which enabled weddings to take place outside a registry office or churches.
Mm.
And the wedding business is very big in country houses. They rent themselves out as film locations.
Yeah.
They have rock festivals, and
But
a
Goodwood,
lot of houses are
look at
doing really
everything that
well.
goes on at Goodwood with, is that the Duke of Richmond?
Yeah, yeah, good. But the Festival of Speed
Yeah,
there,
I mean
yeah,
that
yeah,
has become a part of British annual, society in a way.
yeah,
Uh, yeah,
completely, completely.
fantastic.
But no, the country house is surprisingly healthy
Yeah,
in this time.
yeah.
A
So,
friend of mine, Ben Cowell, has just written a book called The British Country House Revival,
right,
and he looks at the last sort of 40 or 50 years of the country house, and shows that really it's doing quite well. Thank you.
right, right, right. So you mentioned that you're in the midst of a trilogy. Uh,
Hmm.
um, what's next for you? What do you fancy getting your teeth into?
Well, I've got this book on the Guinnesses, a book on
Yeah,
the Guinness country
that's
houses.
interesting.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's
yeah,
that's that's what I'm in the middle of at the moment. And
yeah.
I have a yen to write something about the Regency, maybe the Regency country house.
Hmm.
Not that I'm slavishly following Bridgerton, which I've got to say I've never seen Bridgerton, but I seem to be the only person in the world who's not.
Yeah.
You and I are the only two people.
Oh, no, I don't, I
No.
suppose.
But I've just got more and more interested in the early
Yeah,
19th century,
yeah.
in the Prince Regent, in Brighton Pavilion, in Belvoir Castle, some of the great houses of the early 19th century. So I think the Regency is next for me.
Yeah, and we can't help but ignore what Downton Abbey did
I
to
know, absolutely,
the
absolutely. And
thing.
it might have lost its way a bit later on, but those first couple of seasons of that, I loved it. I thought it was
Yeah.
great.
Do you think it was too romantic,
I think it
idealistic?
wandered a bit. It wandered
Yeah,
a bit, but to
yeah,
start with, I think it was spot on.
yeah.
And it saved, we're talking about saving country houses. It saved Highclere Castle,
Oh,
the
absolutely.
location.
Yeah. And then you and I are old enough to remember upstairs, downstairs.
Oh, and wasn't that great? Wasn't
It
that
was
good fun?
wonderful. It wasn't anywhere near as visually interesting as Downton was. It was
No, it was very set bound, wasn't it? But
yeah, yeah,
still, that
yeah,
kind of milieu, that Edwardian,
yeah,
Edwardian and
yeah.
high society, if you like, was
Right,
was was
right.
brilliant.
So I think Adrian, you and I could probably talk the rest of the day, especially if someone would rustle up a pint of Guinness, but we
Go on,
shouldn't.
go on.
And I think we're going to throw things out to questions and answers. I'm going to need some assistance from my crew here. So we're going to look at one or two, and go from there. So Katie, where should we start first?
We have worked.
With an easy one.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
We've worked the ones we've received in.
Right.
There was another one for you, Mark,
Mm.
from John about the Barbados.
Oh, really? Oh, shall I? Right. Yeah, yeah. What? Let's. Yeah, yeah. So John Windsor Cunningham asked me about if there's any backstory to Murtaugh Guinness being frozen in his freezer. No, from the best of my knowledge, I think he was a very philanthropic and caring Guinness house owner, and I think
Most of them were, Mark. Most of the
yeah.
Guinnesses were.
Yeah, and I think I had the pleasure of meeting Desmond Guinness
Oh, I
and
wish
his
I had.
and his fundraising eyes, as he called them, the bluest eyes you've ever seen in your life. But it was more that the Bayesian staff were terrified that if word got out to where their money came from, that Mr. Guinness was no longer alive, that they would probably stop their pay. Of course, it's a wonderful rumor, but it was funny. Yeah, yeah. Um, all right. Yes. No, yeah. A young lady called Gillian Asen, who I may well be related to, has asked quite an interesting question, actually. So for you, Adrian,
Mm.
um, did you feel that there was a particular country house that really showed in its architecture and design, the personality of the owner. I suppose in some ways, what the fella did at the house in Paynton, I
Mm.
mean, maybe
Yeah.
that did, but is there anything else that?
The one that springs to mind, Mark, is Cardiff Castle,
Mhm.
which was remodeled by a crazy architect, William Burgess. Oh, it's wonderful, for the Marquis of Bute, who owned Cardiff Docks and was one of the richest men in the world, and was a Roman Catholic convert, and was obsessed with the Middle Ages. And Burgess, in the 1860s and 70s, recreated this completely mythical Cardiff Castle. I mean, it's wonderful. There are paintings of knights and damsels. There are fireplaces have battlements to them. It's the only house I know in the world where the duck-billed platypus is used as a decorative motif. The library has duck-billed platypi crawling around it, and monkeys. The dining room at Cardiff, there is a frieze of carved monkeys around the wall. And one of these monkeys has real ivory teeth and a little groundnut in its mouth. And the Marquis, in order to summon the butler, had to shove this nut down the monkey's throat because it was a pneumatic bell push system. It was amazing, absolutely amazing. And the Cardiff Castle, and also Castell Coch, which was another Bute house by Burgess just outside Cardiff, they really do express the owner's personality. Another one, I guess, is Castle Drogo down in Devon, which was built by Edwin Lutyens for Julius Drew, the retail magnate.
Mm.
And Drew wanted to get back to his roots. He wanted to find his ancestry, and he was told that a Norman knight called Drogo had settled in Drew Stainton in Devon in the 11th century or whatever. So he goes to Devon, he buys an estate, and he gets Lutyens to build him a castle. You know, it is the last castle. It's huge, solid granite, battlements, working portcullis. Lutyens said, I wish he didn't want a castle and just a good old country house. But no, Drew wanted something that would express his pedigree, his lineage, if you like.
There's no denying the interest that Americans have with this, you know, British country houses and everything that goes with it. What do you think that's about? I mean, is it just a general interest in old British society and the fact that these houses are
I think,
remnants of that?
that notion of the motherland, you know, is still quite there. And I mean, to me, I know I have a lot of American friends, and they revel in the distant past, in the, you know, in the kind of past that America's not too familiar with, the 17th and 16th and 15th centuries.
Right.
Whereas, you know, I'm fascinated by America's past. I'm fascinated by you know, by the arts and crafts buildings of Green and Green, or by the prairie houses of Frank Lloyd Wright.
Yeah.
I remember
there are some interesting
to
houses here. There really are some interesting houses here, and of course,
wonderful houses.
All that was nouveau, and the architecture was set about, you know, from a different angle, and you know, you have the likes of Falling Water in Pennsylvania,
Fantastic house.
Just incredible place, and those houses were built by people that money was, you know, little unknown.
I once had the privilege of lecturing in Newport, Rhode Island, and you know, I've never seen so many big houses in such a small place.
Yeah. Oh, isn't interesting? John's asked again. Could you imagine copying one of those houses that exist in England physically and building it here in America? Actually, you know what? I wonder if some of those people that we were just talking about, the Americans, did steal ideas and architectural design from some of those houses.
Not only that, they stole houses, didn't steal them.
Yeah.
There was a house in Lancashire called Agecroft Hall, which is a late medieval 15th, early 16th century timber-framed country house. Not a palace, but a big country house. If you want to see Agecroft Hall today, it's not in Lancashire anymore. It's on the banks of the James River in Virginia. It was taken down, reassembled, put back. You know, there's a a 1930s movie, The Ghost Goes West, with Robert Donat, where he's the ghost of a piper in a Scottish castle, and an American millionaire buys the castle, has it taken down stone by stone and put back up in America, and the ghost goes with it.
Yeah,
And the ghost may have been fantasy, but the actual idea of dismantling a country house and putting it up in the States, that's not fantasy at all.
No, I live in the North Shore, Long Island, and there is a golf club near me. And in the middle of that, there is a fabulous residence that Vanderbilt bought in Florence and had it taken apart and shipped to Long Island and rebuilt, and it's there. And it's pure Florence.
And I mean, you only need to go to San Simeon, to Hearst's place, in California, which is fabulous.
So I suppose in a way, I mean, John brought up that question: could you ever imagine, copying one of those houses here in America? But in some ways, it's happened piecemeal with the ideas, but also people have literally have shipped houses from Europe to here.
But also in England, certainly, country houses are still being built, and they tend to be kind of Palladian classical houses. There's not much of a Gothic revival vibe. Right. It tends to be classicism. But I mean, the early 20th century, Hembury is a beautiful copy of one of Palladio's villas in the Veneto. It's brand new and it's beautiful, but it's a copy.
Yeah. Well, I've really enjoyed this, Adrian. I'd love to think that when you get that Guinness book sorted out, that we do this again.
Like a shot. You've made it so easy.
There you go. So this is Adrian's book, and this has been on my bedside for several days now, and I have enjoyed reading it. Adrian, thanks again for your time.
Thank you, Mark.
The folks that have joined us virtually, I'm sure we didn't get to all of your questions, but I hope you've enjoyed listening to us. And thank you. And Adrian, I can't wait to meet you properly rather than a computer screen. With that,
lovely to meet you as well, Mark. Take care of yourself.
Aforementioned pint of Guinness.
Indeed. Thank you,
Adrian. Thank you.
Thank you.